Cathvorin had witnessed the death of 17 species across his long career as a cultural archivist for the Silithian Collective. And he had learned one universal truth in all that time. Every species died the same way when facing extinction. With tears and begging and desperate pleas for mercy that never came, he stood now at the observation deck of the neutral vessel Whisper of Silence, his forearms folded behind his back as he watched the massive armada of the Collective of 13 spread across the void like a plague of metal and fire. 300 warships from 13 different spacefaring civilizations had gathered here in the Damari system for one purpose alone: to finally end the human problem once and for all. The humans have been a thorn in the galaxy's side for nearly 2 centuries now, ever since they had stumbled out of their little blue world and refused to accept their place at the bottom of the galactic hierarchy. They were weak compared to the Morath warrior clans and primitive compared to the Volanthi engineers, and laughably short-lived compared to the ancient Silithians like himself. Yet somehow they had survived every attempt to crush them, spreading like weeds across dozens of star systems until the Collective had finally decided that enough was enough. Cathvorin adjusted his recording implants and prepared to document what would surely be the final chapter of human history. Before him floated the last remnants of their species, a ragged fleet of perhaps 90 vessels protecting a cluster of colony ships that carried what remained of humanity. Roughly 200,000 souls, according to the intelligence reports. Their homeworld had been glassed 3 years ago. Their major colonies scattered and burned. Their population reduced from billions to this pitiful handful of refugees running out of places to hide. The Grand Admiral of the Collective Fleet, a massive Morath named Krethgor, had already broadcast the terms of surrender across all frequencies. The message had been simple and direct: surrender unconditionally, and your deaths will be quick. Resist, and we will make your extinction last for generations. Cathvorin had heard such ultimatums before, and he knew what came next: the weeping transmissions, the fractured leadership turning on each other, the desperate escape attempts that would be hunted down one by one. He prepared his archival notes with the clinical detachment of a scholar who had seen too much death to be moved by it anymore. But something strange was happening on the human fleet. Instead of the chaos he expected, the human ships were moving into formation with a precision that seemed almost choreographed, their smaller vessels taking position around the larger ones in patterns that his tactical analysis software could not quite identify. A transmission crackled across the open frequencies, broadcast from the human flagship on a channel that every ship in the system could receive. It was a woman's voice, calm and steady as still water on a windless day. "This is Admiral Chen Wei-Lin of the Human Defense Fleet. To all vessels under my command, they are behind us. Our children are behind us. Our future is behind us. So we do not retreat today. We do not retreat." Cathvorin felt his secondary heart skip a beat as he processed her words. She was not negotiating. She was not surrendering. She was not even acknowledging the impossible odds against her. A second transmission followed from somewhere else in the human fleet. A younger voice, thick with emotion but not with fear. "Understood, Admiral Destroyer Wing 7, reporting ready. All pilots volunteers, all crews volunteers. We know what we signed up for." Then another voice, and another and another. Dozens of human ships reporting their readiness for battle against an enemy that outnumbered them 300 to 1. Cathvorin turned to his colleague, a younger Silithian named Vethmora, who served as his assistant on this mission. "What are they doing?" he asked. Though he feared he already knew the answer, Vethmora's skin had turned the pale blue of confusion as she studied her own displays. "They appear to be preparing for combat," she replied, her voice uncertain. "But that cannot be correct. No rational species would engage against these odds when surrender remains an option. But the humans were not surrendering. Instead, their fleet began to move. Every ship from the battle-scarred cruisers down to what appeared to be armed cargo haulers accelerating toward the collective armada. They were not fleeing. They were not scattering. They were charging directly into the teeth of Annihilation Grand Admiral. Krethgor's voice boomed across the command frequency, his confusion evident even through the translator, Human Admiral. I do not understand your actions. You cannot win this engagement. Your fleet will be destroyed within the first hour of combat. Explain yourself. Admiral Chum's response came without hesitation. You asked us to surrender. We decline. You asked us to die quietly. We decline that too. If you want our children, you will have to come through us first. And we intend to make that journey cost you more than you can possibly imagine. The collective fleet had stopped advancing, seemingly frozen by the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. Kethvorn pulled up everything he could find on human history, searching for some explanation for behavior that defied every model of rational self-preservation he had ever studied. What he found made his blood run cold. Thermopylae 300 warriors standing against an empire because retreat was not in their nature. The Alamoa, handful of soldiers fighting to the last breath against overwhelming forces. Stalingrad, city of millions refusing to surrender even as it burned around them. 1,000 stories of humans choosing death over submission, of last stands and final charges and defiant ends that serve no logical purpose except to prove that they could not be broken. He found a phrase that had no translation in any galactic language. Going down swinging. It meant to keep fighting even when victory was impossible. To make your enemy pay for every inch of ground. To refuse surrender, not because you could win, but because surrender was simply not something you were willing to do. The human fleet was closing the distance now, their engines burning bright against the darkness of space. Kethvorn zoomed his visual sensors on the lead vessel, the flagship Defiance, where Admiral Chun commanded her impossible charge. Through the viewport, he could see human faces illuminated by console lights. And what he saw there shook him to his core. They were not crying. They were not praying. They were smiling as they raced toward their own destruction, with weapons hot and hearts full of something he could not name. They are insane, Vethmara whispered beside him, but Kethvorn shook his head slowly as understanding began to dawn in his ancient mind. No, he replied quietly, they're not insane. They're simply human. And I am beginning to understand why the old records speak of them with such dread. The first human fighters launched from their carriers, tiny sparks of light racing ahead of the main fleet like the vanguard of some terrible storm. This was not a surrender. This was not a last desperate gamble. This was a statement written in fire and blood, a promise that humanity would not go quietly into the dark, that they would make the galaxy remember them even if that memory was carved into the hulls of burning warships. Kethvorn began recording with renewed intensity because he realized now that he was not documenting an extinction, he was documenting something far more dangerous. The moment when the collective of 13 learned why you should never corner a human with nothing left to lose. Admiral Chen Wei-Lin stood at the center of her bridge aboard the HSS Defiance, watching the endless sea of enemy vessels grow larger on her view screen with every passing second. Her crew moved around her with practiced efficiency, each officer focused on their station, each face set with grim determination. She had served in the human defense fleet for 32 years, and she had known this day would come eventually. The day when there was nowhere left to run and nothing left to do but turn and face the enemy head-on. Behind her fleet floated the colony ships carrying the last 200,000 humans in existence. Families and children and elderly and everyone who had survived the burning of Earth and the fall of the colonies, she could hear them on the civilian frequencies. Not screaming or crying, but singing old songs from a world that no longer existed. Lullabies and anthems and hymns to a planet that was now nothing but ash and memory. Her communications officer looked up from his console. "Admiral, the collective is demanding we explain our actions." They seemed genuinely confused. Chun allowed herself a small smile. Let them be confused. Lieutenant Confusion is the first crack in their armor. Across the void. Aboard the observation vessel Whisper of Silence. Kethvorin was frantically accessing every database he could reach, trying to understand the psychology of a species that would charge willingly into certain death. He found records of human wars that stretched back thousands of years. Conflicts fought with sticks and stones that somehow carried the same spirit he was witnessing now. There was something in the human genome. Some twisted strand of defiance that made them incapable of accepting defeat even when defeat was the only logical outcome. His tactical display showed the closing distance between the fleet's 10,000 kilometers and shrinking rapidly. The collective commanders were issuing orders across their network, their voices carrying notes of uncertainty that Kethvorin had never heard before. All vessels prepare for engagement. Grand Admiral Krethgor commanded, target their lead ships first and break their formation once their command structure falls. The rest will surrender. But Kethvorin was not so sure anymore. He had been studying human unit cohesion, and he had discovered something disturbing. Human soldiers did not fight for their commanders or their governments or even their own survival. They fought for the person standing next to them. They fought for their families back home. They fought because giving up meant admitting that everything they loved could be taken from them. And that was something the human spirit simply would not allow on the Defiance. Admiral Chun opened a channel to her entire fleet, all ships. "This is Chun. I know what we are facing today, and I know what it will cost us. But I also know who we are fighting for." She paused, letting her words settle across the hundreds of vessels under her command. "My daughter is on the colony ship Horizon. She turned 6 years old last week, and she asked me why the bad aliens wanted to hurt us. And I could not give her an answer that made sense, because there is no answer that makes sense." Her voice hardened with something that was not quite anger. Something deeper and older. "But I could give her a promise. I promised her that her mother would stand between her and anyone who tried to harm her. And today I am keeping that promise. Today, we all keep that promise together, across the fleet." Thousands of humans heard her words and felt something stir in their chests in the fighter bay of the carrier, Relentless. Pilots were climbing into their cockpits with full knowledge that most of them would not return. A young pilot named Marcus strapped himself in and activated his flight systems, then reached up to touch the photograph taped to his console, his wife and infant son, both waiting on the colony ships behind him. His wing commander, a woman named Rodriguez, who had survived the fall of 3 colonies already, spoke over their private channel. "You ready for this, rookie?" Marcus checked his weapons one final time. "My boy's back there, Commander. I was born ready." Rodriguez laughed. And it was not a bitter laugh or a frightened laugh, but something wild and fierce. "Then let us go introduce ourselves to these collective bastards. First round of drinks in the afterlife is on me." Kethvorin intercepted their transmission and felt his blood chill at the casual way they discussed their own deaths. He pulled up the collective's tactical predictions, which showed the human fleet being destroyed within the first 90 minutes of engagement, with acceptable losses to the collective of perhaps 15%, but something about those numbers felt wrong. Now he began running his own calculations, factoring in variables that the collective's computers had not considered, human reaction times that seemed impossibly fast. human pain tolerance that exceeded every known species, human willingness to trade their own lives for enemy kills. The human willingness to trade their own lives for enemy kills. The numbers he got back made no sense at all on the bridge of the collective flagship. Grand Admiral Krethgor was receiving reports from his psychological warfare division that troubled him deeply. Grand Admiral, we are detecting anomalous readings from the human vessels. Their crew biosigns indicate elevated heart rates and adrenaline production consistent with combat readiness. But their neural patterns do not match our fear response models. Krethgor leaned forward in his command. Thrawn, explain. Sir, they are not afraid. Our analysis indicates their emotional state more closely resembles anticipation or even eagerness, as if they are looking forward to this engagement. The Grand Admiral sat back. His four eyes narrowing, he had conquered 17 worlds and crushed dozens of species beneath his heel. But he had never faced an enemy that wanted to fight him fear. Was the great equalizer in war, even the bravest warriors hesitated when death approached. And that hesitation created openings for exploitation. But what did you do against an enemy who did not hesitate at all? An enemy who ran toward death like a lover rushing to an embrace. The human fleet had close to 5,000 kilometers now. While within weapons range, and then something strange happened. Music began playing from the human vessels. Broadcast on open frequencies, loud enough for every ship in the system to detect it, was harsh and driving, full of screaming instruments and pounding rhythms. And it seemed to pulse with barely contained violence. Thorn's translation software struggled to interpret the lyrics, finally producing a rough approximation. We are not going to take it. No, we are not going to take it. We are not going to take it anymore. The collective commanders exchanged confused glances across their communication network. Was this some kind of psychological warfare? An attempt to unnerve them before the engagement? But Kethvorn understood with a clarity that terrified him. The humans were not trying to frighten their enemies. They were celebrating. They were singing their death songs. They were declaring to the universe that even in their final moments, they would not bow down the first human. Fighters reached engagement range, and the void lit up with weapons fire. Kethvorn watched in horrified fascination as the tiny human craft dove straight into the collective's defensive screen, not bothering with evasive maneuvers, just burning hard and fast toward the largest targets they could find. The fighters were being destroyed by the dozens. But for every human pilot that died, a collective ship took damage, and through it all, the music kept playing. The humans were not just fighting. Kethvorn realized they were making a statement, carving their defiance into the very fabric of space itself. This was not a battle. This was a declaration of war against the concept of surrender itself, and the collective had no idea how to respond to an enemy who had already accepted death and found it wanting. The battle had been raging for 3 hours, and nothing was going according to the collective's carefully calculated predictions. Kethvorn stood frozen at his observation post, his recording implants working overtime to capture every moment of the chaos unfolding before him. He had expected a slaughter, and he was witnessing one, but it was not the slaughter anyone had anticipated. The humans were dying by the hundreds, their ships burning and breaking apart across the void. But they were taking the collective with them in numbers that should have been mathematically impossible. A high human frigate called the Ironbound had lost its main engines in the first wave of combat, leaving it drifting helplessly near a cluster of collective destroyers. Standard tactical doctrine across every species Kethvorn had ever studied demanded that a disabled ship either surrender or wait for destruction. The Ironbound did neither. Instead, its captain used the last of its maneuvering thrusters to angle the crippled vessel directly at the nearest collective carrier. Burning every remaining ounce of fuel to build up speed, Kethvorum watched the impact in slow motion. The human frigate crashing through the carrier's hull like a fist through glass. Both ships detonating in a fireball that took two nearby destroyers with them. The pilot's final transmission echoed across all frequencies. "Tell my daughter I did not run." He was beginning to understand that humans did not measure victory the way other species did. They did not count ships destroyed or territory gained. They counted the price. They made their enemies pay, and right now the price was climbing, higher than anyone had imagined possible across the battlefield. Human boarding parties were launching from their damaged cruisers. Tiny shuttles packed with soldiers in combat armor who crashed into collective vessels and began fighting their way through corridor by corridor. Grand Admiral Krethgor received reports from the ships under attack, and what he heard made his warrior's blood run cold. "They will not stop," screamed a Morth captain whose vessel had been boarded 20 minutes ago. "We kill them and they keep coming. We shot one of them 7 times, and he crawled forward with his weapon and killed 3 of my soldiers before he finally died. They are demons. They are monsters." The Morth were the most feared warriors in the collective, bred for combat across generations, victors of 100 campaigns, and they were being driven back by creatures half their size who refused to acknowledge wounds that should have been instantly fatal. Kethvorum accessed the combat footage from the boarded vessels, and what he saw haunted him for the rest of his long life. Human soldiers advancing through burning corridors, their armor scorched and cracked, blood floating in zero gravity around them from wounds they seemed not to notice. One human had lost his weapon and his right arm below the elbow, and he had not stopped. He had picked up a metal pipe from the debris and continued fighting with his remaining hand, smashing through Morth armor with nothing but fury and desperation, an absolute refusal to surrender. Another squad of humans had gotten trapped in a compartment that was venting atmosphere, their suits damaged and their air running out. Any other species would have surrendered or simply waited to die. Instead, they sealed their helmets, took one last breath of the thinning air, and charged out singing some ancient human battle hymn as they crashed into the Morth defenders with knives and fists and teeth. The Morth broke for the first time in recorded history. Morth warriors fled from an enemy, abandoning their positions and retreating deeper into their own ship, while the dying humans advanced step by bloody step on the observation vessel. Vethmara had to turn away from the screens, her Silithian sensibilities overwhelmed by the brutality she was witnessing. But Kethvorum could not look away. He was witnessing something that would change the galaxy forever, and he knew he had to record every moment. "They treat death as currency," he murmured to himself, finally finding words for what he was seeing. "They spend their lives like coins, purchasing enemy blood with their own." He searched through human psychological records and found a concept that made terrible sense. Now humans did not fear death the way other species did. They feared living without purpose, living without protecting what they loved, living knowing they had surrendered when they could have fought. Death in battle was not a tragedy to them. It was a transaction, an exchange of one life for as many enemy lives as possible, and they were very good at making unfavorable exchanges. The collective's casualty reports were coming in now, and Grand Admiral Krethgor stared at them in disbelief. 40% of the human fleet had been destroyed in the first 3 hours of combat. That was expected. That was acceptable, but 23% of the collective fleet had been destroyed or disabled as well, against an enemy that was outnumbered 300 to 1. The mathematics made no sense. The humans should have been crushed in the first hour with minimal losses to the collective. Instead, they were bleeding the armada at a rate that would make total victory cost more than the entire campaign had been budgeted to spend. "Order our vessels to maintain distance," Krethgor commanded. His voice strained. "Do not allow them to close for boarding. They are too dangerous in close quarters." But the humans had already adapted to his tactics without the ability to board. They simply started ramming. A human destroyer called the Final Word had taken critical damage to its weapon systems, leaving it unable to fight back against the collective ships surrounding it. The captain, a woman named Okonkwo, who had lost her entire family when Earth burned, did not surrender. Instead, she overloaded her ship's reactor, aimed the vessel at the largest concentration of enemy ships she could find, and accelerated to maximum speed. The explosion took out 2 collective cruisers and damaged 4 more. Her final transmission was not a scream or a prayer, but a simple statement: "Now we are even." Kethvorin did not understand what she meant until he checked her service record and found that she had been aboard the station that watched Earth die, that she had sworn an oath that day to take back everything the collective had taken from her. She had died paying a debt, and her crew had died with her willingly. This was not war as the galaxy understood it. This was something far older and far more terrifying. This was vengeance made manifest. Spite given physical form, hatred distilled into something pure and incandescent. The collective had come to end humanity, but they had not understood what humanity really was. Humans were not a species. They were a promise, a threat, a declaration that some things could not be taken without cost, and the cost they were extracting today would be remembered for millennia. Kethvorin's colleague finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "They are not trying to win this battle. They cannot win this battle." Kethvorin nodded slowly. "No, they are trying to make victory cost more than we are willing to pay. They are making us choose between destroying them and destroying ourselves. And I am no longer certain which option is worse." The battle raged on. Human ships burning and breaking and somehow still fighting, still advancing, still making the galaxy's most powerful alliance bleed for every inch of space they claimed. And somewhere on the colony ships behind the carnage, human children watched the flashes of distant explosions and prayed for their parents and grandparents, and siblings who were buying their survival one life at a time. 6 cycles had passed since the Battle of Damari, and the galaxy would never be the same. Kethvorin sat in his quarters aboard the Whisper of Silence, reviewing his final archive entries before submitting them to the Silithian Historical Database. He had witnessed the death of 17 species across his long career, and he had thought he understood what extinction looked like. He had been wrong. The war had ended 3 cycles ago, not with human extinction as the collective had planned, but with a ceasefire that shocked every government in known space. After the Morith withdrew their forces at Damari, the alliance had collapsed entirely within 2 weeks, each species blaming the others for the catastrophic losses, each rushing to distance themselves from a campaign that had become the most expensive military failure in galactic history. The final accounting had been devastating. The human fleet lost 71% of its combat vessels and nearly 30,000 personnel, a level of destruction that would have broken any other species in existence. But the collective lost 55% of its combined forces, 165 warships from 13 species, crewed by over 200,000 soldiers and sailors, against an enemy that had been outnumbered 300 to 1. The mathematics were impossible. Yet the wreckage floating in the Damari system proved them true. Kethvorin had spent the cycle since the battle conducting interviews and gathering records, trying to understand how a species facing extinction had somehow turned the tables on the galaxy's most powerful alliance. The answers he found haunted his dreams. 3 collective species had formally apologized to humanity within a cycle of the ceasefire, their governments terrified of what the humans might do if given time to rebuild and remember. 2 others had begun trade negotiations, desperate to be on the right side of whatever came next. The remaining 8 maintained armed neutrality, Their fleets pulled back from human space, their expansion plans quietly abandoned, because they had finally learned what humans were not the strongest species. The Morith were stronger, not the smartest. The Velanthi were smarter, not the longest lived, or the most numerous, or the most technologically advanced, but the only species in galactic history who treated their own annihilation as an inconvenience, rather than an ending. Kethvarn had interviewed a human diplomat named Sarah Okafor 2 cycles after the ceasefire, a woman who had lost her husband and son when Earth burned, and who now represented her species at the negotiating table. He had asked her the question that haunted him most. Your species was nearly destroyed. You lost your homeworld and billions of your people. How are you not broken? Her response would stay with him forever. She had smiled, that terrifying expression humans wore so easily, and her eyes had held something ancient and patient. Because now you know what we are. Willing to pay. You have seen what it costs to fight us, what it costs to take from us, what it costs to try and break us. She had leaned forward, and for a moment, Kethvarn had felt like prey before a predator that was simply choosing not to strike. And now you have to ask yourselves, next time, when we are stronger, when we have rebuilt our fleet and our numbers, when we have 100 years of hatred behind us instead of just a decade, are you willing to pay that price again? She had paused, because we will remember every name we lost, every ship we buried, every child who grew up without parents because of what you did to us. We will remember. And we will teach our children to remember, and their children after them. Humans do not forgive, we negotiate. We trade, we coexist, but we do not forgive. And we certainly do not forget. So maybe think carefully before you give us another reason to come for you. The interview had ended there, and Kethvarn had not slept properly since. He understood now why the galaxy dreaded humanity. It was not their ships or their weapons or even their terrifying willingness to die. It was their patience, their memory, their absolute certainty that time was on their side. They were already rebuilding, quietly and methodically, converting civilian vessels to military specifications and training new crews and designing new weapons based on everything they had learned during the war, and they were not rushing. Because humans understood something that the rest of the galaxy had never grasped. That victory was not just about winning today's battle, but about ensuring your enemies feared tomorrow's. The children who had watched their parents die at Damari were growing up now, and they were learning to fly ships and build weapons and hate with a purity that terrified everyone who understood what it meant in a generation. Maybe, too, humanity would be strong again, and they would remember everything. Kethvarn finished his archive with a single recommendation, flagged for distribution to every species in the galactic database. He had thought for a long time about how to express what he had learned, how to convey the full weight of what he had witnessed to civilizations that had never faced anything like humanity before. In the end, he had chosen simplicity. Do not make enemies of humans, not because you cannot defeat them. You might be able to destroy them if you commit everything you have and accept losses beyond anything you have ever imagined. But because the cost of their hatred, passed down through generations unending, will outlast stars. They are not the strongest species. They are not the smartest. They are not the most advanced. But they are the only species in recorded history who treat extinction as a setback rather than an end, who transform their grief into fuel and their dead into reasons to keep fighting. They will make you pay for every inch, and they will never, ever stop. If you must deal with humans, deal with them fairly, trade with them honestly, respect their boundaries, and never give them cause to add your species to the list of grudges they carry forward through time. Because I have seen what happens when humans decide that a species has wronged them beyond forgiveness. I watched them march to war against impossible odds with songs on their lips and fire in their hearts. And I watched the mightiest alliance in galactic history break itself against their refusal to surrender. They did not win that battle. They lost most of their fleet and thousands of their people, but they made us afraid. And that fear will last longer than any victory we could have achieved. Ketvorn submitted his archive and leaned back, suddenly exhausted by the weight of everything he had witnessed. Somewhere out there in the void, humanity was rebuilding, remembering, and waiting, and the galaxy had learned a lesson it would never forget, that there are worse things than being conquered by an enemy. There is making an enemy who will never stop fighting, never stop remembering, and never stop making you pay for what you took from them. The humans had a phrase for what they had become after Damari, one that Ketvorn had added to his archive as a final warning. They called themselves survivors, and survivors, he now understood, were the most dangerous things in the universe because they had already lost everything that could be taken from them. All that remained was the fight, and humans were very, very good at fighting. 7 hours after the battle began, an uneasy silence had fallen across the Damari system. Both fleets had pulled back to regroup. The void between them filled with wreckage and debris and the frozen bodies of thousands who had died in the longest day the galaxy had ever witnessed. Ketvorn stood at his observation post and tried to make sense of the numbers on his display. But the numbers refused to make sense, no matter how many times he ran the calculations. The human fleet had lost 62% of its combat vessels, 56 ships destroyed outright, and another dozen so badly damaged they would never fight again by any standard military metric. They had been devastated, but the collective had lost 41% of its own forces, 123 warships from 13 different species, crewed by tens of thousands of soldiers, and sailors who had expected an easy victory and found something else. Entirely 41% losses against an inferior enemy that was outnumbered 300 to 1. The implications were staggering. Ketvorn intercepted transmissions from the collective command network, and what he heard confirmed his worst fears. The alliance was fracturing. This campaign was supposed to cost us 15% losses at most, raged the Morath High Commander to Grand Admiral Krethgor. We have lost nearly 3 times that number, and the humans still have ships in that void. This is not a victory. This is a catastrophe. We can still destroy them, Krethgor replied, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. They are weakened. One more assault will finish them. And how many more of our ships will that assault cost us? Demanded the Volanthi delegate. 20% more. 30. We came here to eliminate a pest, not to bleed ourselves dry against madmen who refuse to die properly. The argument continued, growing more heated with each exchange. Ketvorn turned his attention to the human fleet, expecting to find the same despair and recrimination that was consuming the collective leadership. What he found instead shattered everything he thought he understood about the species he was observing. The humans were not arguing. They were working aboard every surviving vessel. Crews were laboring without rest to repair damage and restore functionality, welding armor plates and rerouting power systems, and doing impossible things with salvaged parts and sheer determination. He intercepted a transmission from the carrier Relentless, where the flight deck crews had been working for 6 hours straight to get damaged fighters back in the air. Chief, we need another 3 hours to get these birds ready for launch, reported an exhausted engineer. The chief's response was immediate. We have 2 hours. The collective is regrouping, and the admiral says we need everything that can fly in the void when they come back. So figure it out. There was no complaint, no protest, just a weary acknowledgement and the sound of tools resuming their worketh for and searched for signs of collapse, of broken morale. of the surrender that should have been inevitable after such devastating losses. Instead, he found pilots who had survived the first engagement already. Requesting new ships, he found civilians from the colony ships volunteering to crew damaged vessels. People with no military training whatsoever strapping themselves into unfamiliar stations because there was no one else left. Found children recording messages for parents who were about to launch again, not crying or begging them to stay, but telling them to make the enemy remember this day. One message in particular lodged in his mind like a splinter. A young human girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, speaking directly into the camera with eyes that held no fear. "Mama, I know you have to go fight again. I want you to know that I am not scared. I am proud of you. And if you do not come back, I will grow up, and I will remember, and I will make them pay for taking you from me. I love you, Mama." Cathvorn felt something cold settle into his heart as the full weight of what he was witnessing finally became clear. The humans were not just fighting this battle, they were fighting every battle that would come after. They were planting seeds of hatred in the next generation, ensuring that even if they lost today, their children and their children's children would carry the grudge forward. He searched human historical records and found a concept that made his blood freeze: blood debt. Among humans, certain offenses could never be forgiven, could never be forgotten, could only be repaid in kind across generations if necessary. Collective had burned their homeworld and killed billions of their people, and in doing so, they had created a debt that would never be settled, that would be passed down through human bloodlines like a genetic curse 1,000 years from now. If any humans survived, they would still tell stories about this day, still teach their children who their enemies were, still nurse their hatred like a precious flame. The humans were not just enduring, they were adapting, evolving, becoming something harder and sharper with every death they suffered. Cathvorn intercepted another transmission, this one from Admiral Chun to her remaining captains. "I know what we lost today. I know who we lost. I remember every name, and I know you do too. But we are not done yet." Her voice was tired but unbowed. "The collective came here expecting us to break. They expected us to surrender when we saw their numbers. They expected us to die quietly and conveniently. And we showed them something else instead." A pause. And when she spoke again, there was steel in every word. "We showed them that we can bleed them. We showed them that every human life cost them 10 of theirs. We showed them that destroying us will cost more than keeping us alive. And now we have to show them one more thing. We have to show them that we can do this forever." Another transmission went out across all frequencies. Broadcast to both fleets, collective of 13. "This is Admiral Chun Wei-Lin. You have fought us for 7 hours and lost 40% of your forces against an enemy a fraction of your size. You have seen what we are willing to pay for our survival." She let the words hang in the silence of space. "So I ask you now, can you pay the same price? Can you afford to lose another 40% to finish us off? And when you go home with half your fleet destroyed and nothing to show for it, but the ashes of a species that made you bleed for every inch, how will your people react? We can do this forever, can you?" The collective network erupted with panicked communication as her words sank in. The Morath delegation announced they were withdrawing their remaining forces, unwilling to suffer further losses in what they now called an unwinnable war against lunatics. 2 other species followed within the hour, pulling their ships back from the engagement zone despite Grand Admiral Krethgor's furious demands that they hold formation. The alliance was breaking apart, not because the humans had defeated them militarily, but because they had made victory cost too much. Cathvorn understood now why the ancient records spoke of humans with such dread. They were not the strongest species, or the smartest, or the most advanced, but they were the only species in galactic history, who could turn their own destruction into a weapon, who could make their enemies ask whether winning was worth the price, and watching the collective tear itself apart over that question. He knew the answer was becoming clearer with every ship that retreated from the field. Sometimes the only way to win against humans was not to fight them at all. And the galaxy was just beginning to learn that lesson.